Nora Bellamy, a 69-year-old widow, stood silently on the porch as her only daughter Rachel closed the door behind her. No arguments, no begging, just the hollow click of finality. Rachel's husband Tyler leaned in the background, his arms crossed like a judge passing sentence. "We can't keep supporting you," Rachel said flatly. "It's not personal, it's just time." Nora clutched a faded handbag and a scuffed suitcase as if they were shields against the world. What Rachel didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Nora had quietly resigned from her part-time work at the community co-op after back pain made it unbearable. She hadn't been fired, and tucked inside her purse was a debit card granting her access to a private trust containing $1.4 million money she had secured from the unexpected sale of a forgotten parcel of land left by a distant relative decades ago. But Nora didn't spend a dime on hotels or revenge. She walked away with her head high, not to escape, but to rebuild. Quietly, and this time on her own terms. The sidewalk was uneven and her suitcase rattled against it like a stubborn child. Each step away from that porch felt heavier than the last, but Nora didn't pause. Her spine ached, her knees protested, but her pride held her upright. The autumn wind tugged at the sleeves of her coat, worn at the cuffs and patched twice on the elbows. People passed her on the street and looked through her the same way folks often do with women her age, present but unseen. At the corner she paused at a bus stop bench, sat slowly and exhaled like she was releasing a lifetime of held-in breath. No tears. Not then. Nora had cried in silence years before when her husband died suddenly in a factory accident when she worked night shifts, cleaning surgical suites just to buy Rachel a prom dress. She had wept quietly in kitchens, in church pews, in motel bathrooms, and then kept going. But this being discarded by the very child she'd sacrificed for this ache was too deep for tears. It just settled in her chest like a stone. A man passed by, pushing a cart full of cans. He nodded at her. She nodded back. No judgment, no pity, just recognition. Nora smiled faintly. That kind of honesty was rare. When the bus came, she didn't board. Instead, she walked another 4 blocks to the shelter downtown. It was a red brick building tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat. Faint lights flickered inside. She entered quietly, signed her name with a pen on a chain, and accepted a cot in the back. Nobody asked why she was there. That was the kindness of places like this. She shared the little granola bar in her purse with the woman beside her, who smelled like peppermint and cigarette smoke, and listened as she rambled about her lost dog. Nora nodded along, offering soft machims and patient eyes. The woman finally fell asleep mid-sentence, her head lolling against Nora's shoulder. In the stillness, Nora allowed herself a quiet smile. She wasn't alone. She was among her kind, those the world didn't see until they were gone. The next morning, Nora walked across town to a little cottage she'd seen years ago. On a walk, always admiring it from afar. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and weeds had overrun the garden, but it had good bones. It felt like her. She called a number listed on a faded real estate sign still hanging half loose from a fence post. The agent, surprised by her no-nonsense tone and full cash offer, agreed to meet that afternoon. By sundown, she had the keys. Nora used a small business LLC, Olive Haven, named after her grandmother, to keep the purchase quiet. She didn't want Rachel or anyone else connecting dots they never cared about when she had nothing. She spent the first night on the bare floor, lying on a borrowed sleeping bag, watching shadows play across the ceiling. It was cold, drafty, and smelled like mothballs, but it was hers. Over the next few weeks, she hired contractors with good reputations and quiet mouths. She paid in full, always in person. New windows, a sealed roof, solar panels, and a ramp installed by a local veterans crew. She grew herbs in the window box and tomatoes in recycled pails. Every nail hammered into the wood felt like stitching her dignity back together. No one in the neighborhood knew her past. To them, she was just Miss Nora, an older lady with kind eyes who always waved from her porch. She wore the same beat-up coat cooked from scratch and often had a pot of coffee on for the mail carrier or anyone passing through. She didn't talk much about herself, but she listened. And when people spoke, she truly heard them. On Sundays, she visited the co-op she used to work at, not to volunteer, just to smile at the cashier, donate quietly, and buy a few essentials. She never stood in line for long. People made space for her, unknowingly, like the universe owed her that much. What Rachel and Tyler never realized was that their dismissal set something free in her. They took her place, but she claimed her purpose. And in that small, resurrected house on the edge of town, Nora Bellamy was no longer invisible. She was rooted, rebuilding a world from the ground up, and she was just getting started. Nora's first night at the downtown shelter had the strange rhythm of both familiarity and estrangement. She'd been through harder nights, lonelier ones too, but not like this. Not with her daughter's words still echoing in her ears, not with the weight of knowing she hadn't fallen, but had been pushed. The shelter was a converted church basement. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the linoleum floors carried the scent of bleach soup and old coats. Plastic cots lined the walls in 2 rows, separated by curtains and thin hopes of privacy. Nora found a cot near the far end, quiet, a little drafty, but far enough from the snoring cluster, and close to the back exit in case she needed a moment alone. She didn't speak much at first, just nodded, offered gentle smiles, and kept her coat on even as she lay back on the cot. The woman next to her, Margie, had a mess of curly hair, 2 black eyes from an abusive boyfriend, and a mouth that didn't know how to stop. "Don't mind me," she said as soon as Nora settled in. "I talk when I'm nervous, can't help it." "You been here before?" Nora shook her head. "No, first night." "Well," Margie replied, tugging a tattered blanket over her knees, "you look like you got some peace in you." "Most don't come in with that." Nora didn't know what to say to that. Peace wasn't the word she'd used, not yet, but she wasn't angry either. She just felt tired of earning love, of proving herself. Maybe that was a kind of peace. Later that night, when the lights dimmed and the murmurs softened into snores, Nora shared the little pack of peanut butter crackers she kept in her coat pocket. She broke them in half and passed them to Margie and the 2 other women in the back row. No grand gesture, just enough to say, "I see you." Margie looked at her and whispered, "You ain't like the rest of them." Nora smiled, not because she agreed, but because she understood. By morning, she was helping an older man find his misplaced shoes, and a younger woman calm her child down with a lullaby Nora remembered from Rachel's infancy. The child clung to her knees like a vine, then smiled when she offered her hand. "You're good with kids," someone said. "I used to be a mom," she replied, and the words caught in her throat. "Used to be." At breakfast, she sipped weak coffee from a chipped mug and talked to Carl, a former mail carrier who'd lost everything in a divorce. He had a tooth missing and a deep, gravelly voice that could hush a crowd. He told her about the corner diner that used to give out free pancakes every Friday until it shut down. "I think," Nora said quietly, "places like that matter more than we realize." Carl nodded. "Yeah, they do." After breakfast, Nora didn't leave right away. She stayed behind to sweep the floor and fold blankets. The shelter's manager, Tessa, gave her a curious look. "You don't have to do that," I know, Nora said, "but it feels good." Tessa didn't ask questions. She just handed Nora a clean rag and pointed to the counter that always collected dust, no matter how often they wiped it. It wasn't much, but for Nora, that little rag felt like a beginning. Each night for the next week, Nora returned. Not because she needed a bed, she had her cottage now, but because she wasn't ready to be alone in silence just yet. She brought food in small batches, fruit, bread, travel-sized toothpaste. She shared what she had listened more than she spoke and held space for others, the way no one had done for her in a long time. She met Dee, a trans woman estranged from her family. Luis, a teenage runaway who kept his hoodie up even while he slept. And Marion, a former opera singer, who now sang softly to himself to calm the tremors in his hands. Each one gave her something she hadn't known she needed: a sense of shared survival. One rainy night, Nora stayed later than usual. The power flickered and the shelter went momentarily dark. She could hear people shifting, nervous. Nora reached for a flashlight in her purse and turned it on, guiding the beam gently across the room. "Don't worry," she called out in her calmest voice. "It's just the rain playing tricks on us." Someone chuckled. The tension broke. Candles were lit. A few folks started telling stories to pass the time. Margie leaned over and whispered, "Told you, you got peace in you." Nora looked around the room. Faces, half-lit eyes, tired but soft laughter, gently rising above the rain. This wasn't a place people dreamed of ending up. But for one night at least, it felt like a place no one wanted to leave. That night on her walk home, Nora stopped in front of a boarded-up diner, the one Carl had talked about. It still had the faded lettering on the window, "Gracie's Kitchen, all welcome." Weeds had climbed the walls. The roof sagged, but Nora didn't see decay. She saw possibility. She reached into her purse, pulled out her notebook, and scribbled one line, "Nora's Hearth, no one left behind." She looked up at the stars breaking through the clouds and whispered, "Let's build it." She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rising. Quietly, relentlessly. A week after her quiet nights at the shelter began, Nora returned to the rundown cottage she'd passed 100 times before. It sat crookedly on the edge of a forgotten street, shielded by overgrown hedges and a rusting mailbox that leaned like it had given up standing. Ivy climbed the siding, clinging stubbornly to cracked paint and chipped brick. The windows were dusty, the porch sagged like an old man's shoulders, and weeds poked defiantly through the crumbling path. But Nora didn't see decay. She saw potential. The real estate agent arrived in a tan SUV, clearly expecting a different kind of buyer. He looked her over, gray hair tucked behind her ears, sensible shoes, a canvas bag slung across her shoulder, and seemed to second-guess the appointment. "Are you here on behalf of someone else?" he asked with polite skepticism. "No," Nora replied, her voice clear but unbothered. "Just me." She didn't haggle. She didn't ask for inspections or quotes. She handed over the cashier's check under the name Olive Haven LLC, a business she had quietly registered months ago when the land sale first processed. She had planned for this, not to impress anyone, not to boast, but because the moment she saw the place, she knew it could be more than just a home. It could be sanctuary. When the deal closed 2 days later, she stood in the middle of the living room, dust motes floating in the sunlight, floorboards groaning under her step, and whispered, "We start fresh here." She made her first call to a local contractor named Jace, a Vietnam vet, with a gentle voice and a reputation for fair prices and clean work. He showed up in a flannel shirt and worn boots, holding a clipboard and chewing a toothpick. After a quiet walkthrough, he said, "This old girl's got good bones. Needs a whole new roof, though. And electrical's a mess." "I want it done right," Nora said. "Solar, too. Efficient. No shortcuts." He raised an eyebrow. "That'll run high." "I'm not worried," she replied, and something in her eyes made him nod without asking further. Within days, the cottage was alive with motion. Crews came in, plumbers, electricians, roofers. Nora was there every morning with a thermos of strong coffee and a notebook of ideas. She never hovered, but she was always present. She asked questions, took notes, offered sandwiches when the work ran long, and slowly the workers grew fond of her. They called her Miss Nora, always with respect, never condescension. She painted the front door herself, a deep moss green. "Green for growth," she said aloud as she brushed the final stroke. The siding was patched and painted a warm cream. New windows opened wide to let the breeze in. Solar panels lined the roof installed by a local youth apprenticeship program she quietly funded after hearing they needed materials. Inside, she chose soft earth tones, clay sage, muted gold. The floors were sanded smooth and treated with a finish that smelled like lemon and memory. The kitchen, once a cracked linoleum cave, now gleamed with reclaimed oak cabinets, open shelves, and a farmhouse sink big enough to bathe a dog in. Nora's favorite part, though, was the sunroom. She had the back wall knocked out and replaced with tall glass panels. There, in the morning light, she placed a simple wooden table and 2 rocking chairs she found at a flea market. She added a rug made by a local artisan and lined the windowsills with potted lavender and basil. At night, the cottage was quiet, no traffic, no noise, just the rustle of trees and the hum of wind through the porch screen. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't trendy, but it was safe, and it was hers. The neighbors started to notice the transformation. A woman named Patrice from 3 doors down stopped one day with a plate of gingerbread cookies and a curious eye. "You don't look like the kind to flip houses," she said playfully. "I'm not," Nora replied, smiling, "just fixing one for now." "Well, you've done more in 2 weeks than the last owner did in 10 years. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to see the value," Nora said, half to herself. Word spread slowly, not of wealth, but of warmth. The mail carrier stayed longer at her gate. Kids peeked through the hedges to watch the garden bloom. Sunflowers mint marigolds. She kept a small wooden box by the front step labeled, "Take what you need." Inside were little things, Band-Aids, granola bars, travel soaps, tea bags. She refilled it every other day. In the evenings, Nora walked through her finished rooms, barefoot, the floor cool beneath her. She lit beeswax candles and let music play softly from an old radio in the kitchen. She cooked from scratch soups, stews, fresh bread. The air always smelled like care. She wasn't preparing for guests, not exactly, but she was ready for anyone who needed a place to feel safe again. And as she sat in the rocking chair one night, the breeze lifting her hair ever so slightly, Nora whispered into the stillness, "This is only the beginning," because the cottage, like her, had been cast aside once, and now, together, they were coming back to life. The work on the cottage had barely finished when Nora began to turn her focus outward again. She had spent weeks settling into her new rhythm, early mornings with coffee on the porch, mid-mornings tending to her small garden, quiet afternoons reading books borrowed from the public library, but something in her spirit felt unfinished. Rest was needed, yes, but healing came from purpose. She returned first to the downtown shelter, not for a bed this time, but with a tote full of basic supplies, sanitary pads, socks, toothbrushes, tiny hotel soaps she'd bought in bulk. No big entrance, no fanfare. She walked in, left the tote at the front desk, and quietly asked, "What else do you need?" Tessa, the shelter manager, looked up in surprise. "Honestly," she said, "everything. We're short on bedding, the roof leaks when it rains, and the water heater's been on its last leg since March." Nora nodded once. "Make me a list," she said. "Don't leave anything out." That evening, Tessa emailed her a spreadsheet, half apologetic, half hopeful. By the next week, workers were on site, replacing shingles, installing a new heater, and repainting the bathrooms. The check came from Olive Haven LLC. No one questioned it. Tessa, sharp as ever, had her suspicions, but she respected Nora's silence. From there, Nora moved quietly through the city like a benevolent shadow. She visited food pantries, community clinics, drop-in centers, always with the same gentle approach. What do you need right now? Not what looked good in a press release, Not what would make donors feel proud, but what would help today, tonight, this hour. At a youth shelter near the freeway, she met Danny, a social worker, with tired eyes and a hopeful grin. Danny talked about how their single laptop was shared among 20 teens, how they'd love to start GED tutoring but had no funds for materials. The next morning, a shipment arrived, 4 refurbished laptops preloaded with learning software and a box of notebooks and pens. At the community health clinic, she overheard a receptionist telling a patient they were out of flu vaccines and wouldn't have more for another 3 weeks. That afternoon, Nora contacted the regional health board and quietly arranged a donation, $5,000, no strings attached, funneled through a church nonprofit under Olive Haven's umbrella. None of it was done for credit. In fact, when a shelter manager offered to put her name on the new wall plaque, Nora politely declined. "Names don't keep people warm," she said, but people remembered her anyway. Not because she made noise, but because she paid attention. She became a fixture at the weekend markets, chatting with farmers about bulk produce, arranging to have surplus food delivered to the shelters on Sunday nights. She slipped envelopes with grocery gift cards into diaper bags at the women's clinic. She funded a new van for a mobile outreach team, only requesting that they add a small sticker to the back bumper, driven by quiet kindness. She started keeping a small spiral notebook in her purse where she jotted down snippets of conversations. A boy at the shelter wanted to learn the guitar. A woman at the bus stop said her shoes were too tight but couldn't afford new ones. Nora would write these down like prayers, and then she'd find a way. Even her interactions with strangers were gentle acts of restoration. She bought lunch for the elderly man who ate alone every Thursday at the cafe. She offered her umbrella to a young mom caught in the rain and walked away before the woman could thank her. One evening, she found a homeless vet outside the library shivering. She left him with a warm coat and a thermos of soup she just happened to have in her tote bag. When he asked for her name, she smiled and said, "Just someone who remembers." That was Nora's true gift, remembering what it felt like to be small, scared, unseen, and using that memory like a compass guiding her toward where she was needed most. Word of Olive Haven spread, but no one could pin down exactly who was behind it. The name appeared on donation receipts, repair invoices, grant forms. But there were no interviews, no photos, no spotlight, only a growing list of people who found their lives a little softer because of it. A mural went up near the shelter, painted by local teens, sunrise colors, outstretched hands, a house with an open door. At the bottom they wrote in block letters, "Thank you to the Invisible Heart." Nora walked by it one morning on her way to the market. She paused, tilted her head, and smiled. Not because she claimed the title, but because someone somewhere had started to understand. She bought extra peaches that day, enough for the shelter, the clinic staff, and a few single moms she'd met through the co-op. And as she filled her tote bags and made her quiet rounds, she didn't feel tired. She felt full, not of pride, not even of joy, but of something steadier, hope in motion. The idea came to her in a flash, though it had been brewing quietly, waiting for the right shape to take. She passed the boarded-up diner on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Rust streaked down its sign, the front windows were covered in plywood, and wild grass curled through the cracked parking lot like nature trying to reclaim it. But even beneath the decay, she saw it checkered floors, the low hum of conversation, the sizzle of a skillet, the warmth of bodies not just fed, but welcomed. That night, Nora stood in front of the dusty entrance under her umbrella, heart thudding in the rain. She remembered Carl, the man from the shelter who spoke of Gracie's kitchen like it was holy ground. Place like that, he had said, makes a man feel like he belongs somewhere again. She wanted to recreate that belonging, and so she did. Through Olive Haven, LLC, Nora purchased the property outright. The seller was stunned. He'd tried for years to unload the eyesore, assuming it was a lost cause. "You sure, ma'am?" he asked. "This place hasn't seen a meal in a decade." "I'm sure," she replied. "It's hungry for a second chance." The renovation was fast but careful. Nora hired locals folks who'd fallen on hard times but hadn't lost their skills. A retired carpenter who'd once done sets for a theater. A young woman fresh out of a halfway house with a knack for tile work. A soft-spoken man named Reggie who used to be a cook before the bottle took him under. They showed up day after day, grateful to work, surprised by the trust. She paid fairly always in person. No contracts, no hierarchy, just a warm meal at the end of every shift, and the unspoken understanding that dignity started with believing people were still capable. The floors were cleaned and restored, a black and white checkerboard polished until it gleamed. The counter was sanded down and restained, now wide enough to fit elbows' laptops or folded newspapers. Reggie oversaw the kitchen repairs with obsessive precision, muttering about grease traps and vent hoods like they were sacred machines. He brought in old pans he'd kept in storage for years, treating them like heirlooms. The windows were replaced with wide, clear panes, letting in natural light from sunrise to sundown. Nora kept the booths she liked, how the worn leather told stories but had the torn cushions reupholstered in burnt orange and chestnut. She added hooks under the tables for bags, power strips, for phone chargers, and a corner shelf filled with books, board games, and puzzles. The back wall got a fresh mural, a hearth surrounded by mismatched chairs, each one painted in a different color. Over it in gentle script, the words, "Come as you are, stay as long as you need." She named it Nora's Hearth, a tribute to the warmth she'd always longed for, and the place she hoped to give others. It wasn't a soup kitchen, it wasn't a charity, it was a gathering place, no paperwork, no proof of need, just food, conversation, and space. Opening day wasn't advertised. Nora simply unlocked the doors on a Thursday morning and turned the sign to welcome. Within an hour, the first guest wandered in, a man with threadbare shoes and a suspicious glance. She greeted him like a neighbor and offered coffee, eggs, and toast with jam. He nodded, slowly sat down, and ate without saying a word. By noon, more followed. A young couple with a baby, 2 seniors who used to sit in the park all day, 3 teenagers who came in together and tried to act tougher than they felt. Nora moved between tables like air refilling cups, fetching extra napkins, laughing quietly when someone told a story. Reggie worked the kitchen like a man reborn, flipping pancakes with pride. The place didn't feel new, it felt right. Word spread quietly but steadily. People called it that place you can go when you've got nothing but still want to feel human. Volunteers started showing up, bringing baked goods, playing music on Friday nights, teaching knitting in the back booth. Nora never asked for help, but she always said yes when it was offered. One evening, a little girl left a note by the tip jar. "Thank you for being nice to my daddy." He smiled today. Nora tucked it into her apron pocket and didn't tell anyone, but she read it every night before bed. Each day more stories walked through the doors. A woman fleeing an abusive home found the courage to make a plan over hot soup and quiet listening. A runaway teen reconnected with his grandma after charging his phone at the bar. A former banker found solace in washing dishes, humming gospel songs while the water ran. But the most beautiful part nobody ever had to ask. Nora kept the register closed. She kept the lights on. And every night before she left, she walked through the diner and whispered thank you to the chairs, the plates, the floor beneath her feet. Not because she was grateful to them, but because they held the weight of people who were learning how to breathe again. And in the heart of that little diner, Nora built something sacred, without glory, without credit, and without asking for anything in return. Only warmth, only welcome, only home. 2 years passed like a slow unfolding hymn, not rushed, not loud, just steady, faithful. In that time, Nora's Hearth became more than anyone had dreamed. What started as a repurposed diner evolved into something deeper. It was no longer just a warm meal or a second chance. It had become a rhythm, a ritual, a lifeline. Each morning, the scent of fresh bread and simmering broth drifted into the street before sunrise. Neighbors walking their dogs would pause near the entrance, smiling at the familiar glow inside. You could always tell who'd been to Nora's Hearth before they moved a little slower as they approached, like they were stepping into sacred ground. There was no front desk, no intake process, just a sign on the door, "Come in, you matter here." On Fridays, the place transformed into something almost magical. Community dinner night. People from every part of town showed up. Retired teachers, single moms, teenagers with nowhere else to be. Kids ran through the garden in the back, chasing one another between rows of wildflowers and raised vegetable beds. Volunteers set long wooden tables end to end across the dining area, covered in mismatched tablecloths and lined with dishes passed down from grandmothers and flea markets. It wasn't quiet, but it was peaceful. The kind of peace that comes with belonging. There was always music, sometimes a young violinist playing soft folk tunes, sometimes just Reggie humming old blues as he stirred the soup pot. Laughter bubbled up from booths and corners, from children with jelly on their cheeks to elders retelling stories for the third or fourth time. Nora, now with more gray in her braid and more softness in her step, became something of a lighthouse in the space. She still wore her sensible shoes and plain cardigans, always with a handkerchief tucked into one sleeve. She didn't command attention, but she radiated presence. Just her standing nearby made people feel steadier. She was still the first to arrive each morning and often the last to leave. She checked the garden beds herself, clipped herbs for that day's meals, swept the sidewalk and wrote thank you notes to volunteers in neat cursive. Once a month, she hosted a quiet hour where no talking was allowed, only soft music, tea, and a table full of crayons and sketchbooks. People came and sat silently, sketching their thoughts, sometimes crying quietly, sometimes just breathing. The community had shifted around her, not dramatically, but in the small, tender ways that matter. Local businesses started donating surplus items every week. Grocers, bakeries, even a flower shop that left bouquets at the front window. The high school's culinary program began sending students over to intern in Reggie's kitchen. They learned more than cooking there. They learned patience, humility, and pride in feeding others. And still, Nora asked for no spotlight. When a local journalist approached her for a feature story, she gently declined. "Write about the people," she said. "They're the ones building this." Nora's Hearth also became a place for milestones. Birthdays, sobriety anniversaries, job interviews, breakups, reunions. If it mattered to someone, it mattered here. One young woman named Camilla brought her newborn baby for a blessing in the garden, and everyone cried. An elderly man named Lou played the harmonica one Thursday night, and it was the first time anyone had seen him smile in months. And of course, there were losses too. Life didn't spare Nora or her circle. When Margie passed away from complications related to years of untreated illness, Nora lit a candle in the center booth and left a bouquet of marigolds there for a week. No plaque, no speech, just presence. Just remembrance. Winter came and went. The hearth stayed open, warm, glowing. Summer arrived again with its thick air and buzzing insects, but inside it was always the same cool, calm welcoming. One rainy spring evening, a storm knocked out power across half the city. Nora's Hearth stayed lit thanks to its solar panels and battery backups. People showed up soaked and shaken candles flickering in their hands. Nora greeted each one with towels, hot tea, and her steady eyes. Someone whispered, "It's like a sanctuary," and another replied, "It's better. Sanctuaries have rules." But even Nora, resilient as she was, began to feel the weight of years. Her hands ached more in the mornings. She moved a little slower when bending to pick basil from the garden. She kept a notebook on the counter with reminders written in block letters. Check the water heater. Call Patrice. Order more rice. Still, she kept going, because every time she saw someone walk in with shoulders slumped and leave with eyes brighter, it reminded her of the night she sat on a shelter cot, whispering to herself that she still had something to give. Every time a child laughed in the garden, she remembered Rachel's voice saying, "It's not personal, it's just time." And every Friday night, as the lights dimmed and the room filled with the hum of clinking dishes and overlapping stories, Nora would stand behind the counter, her hand resting on the wood she'd sanded herself, and she would smile. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew it deep in her bones. This was what she was meant to build, not just a place, but a promise. And the seasons turned again. Rachel had always believed she was the kind of woman who made the right decisions. Smart, organized, forward-thinking. She was the one who balanced the checkbook, packed the school lunches, and knew exactly which drawer the batteries were in. Her life had a rhythm, one carefully orchestrated by calendars, routines, and firm expectations. But life, it turns out, doesn't care much for planners. It started when Tyler lost his job. He came home one afternoon looking deflated, holding a cardboard box and the kind of silence that filled a room before bad news. "They're downsizing," he muttered. "I'm out, effective immediately." Rachel blinked, trying to absorb the weight of it. Tyler had been with that logistics firm for nearly 11 years. He wasn't just an employee, he was reliable, essential, or so they thought. "Okay," she said, standing straighter. "We'll get through it. You'll find something else." But the something else didn't come. The job market was brutal, flooded with younger, cheaper workers. Weeks passed, then months. Tyler's initial motivation turned to fatigue, then bitterness. He stopped shaving, started sleeping in, and avoided eye contact when she mentioned networking or applications. They argued more. About bills, about the kids, about Nora, especially Nora. "You sure you did the right thing?" Tyler asked one night, 2 glasses of wine deep. "I mean, kicking your own mom out like that." Rachel's jaw clenched. She wasn't contributing. She lied about losing her job. "We have kids to think about." "Yeah," he muttered. "And now she's not our problem. Guess that's convenient." That was the beginning of the end. The mortgage payment slipped behind. First 30 days, then 60. Rachel tried to stay afloat, cutting out cable, canceling the gym, switching to off-brand groceries, but it wasn't enough. Their savings, modest to begin with, dried up within 5 months. Tyler started taking freelance work, warehouse shifts, delivery driving, but it was inconsistent. Then came the foreclosure notice. Thick envelope, red ink, a kind of finality she'd once believed happened only to other people. Tyler didn't stay for the fallout. He left one morning without much warning, said he needed space to figure things out, and maybe the kids would be better off with his sister until things settled. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't have the strength. For the first time in her life, she stood alone in her living room, silent, echoing, and realized she had nothing to hold on to but guilt. Guilt that she'd pushed her mother away. Guilt that she hadn't seen this coming. Guilt that after all her judging, she now found herself in the very shoes she'd once looked down on. She moved into a friend's basement temporarily. Not a close friend, more like an acquaintance with an extra cot and a wary smile. Rachel kept to herself. She showered, quickly cleaned obsessively, and apologized for everything. She scrolled job boards at night, fighting tears and mouse clicks, trying to will her old life back. One rainy afternoon, she ducked into the public library for warmth. Her umbrella had snapped in the wind, and her coat, an old one she'd pulled from storage, soaked through quickly. She wandered the aisles, trying not to look lost, until she saw it. A flyer, cream-colored paper, elegant script, a logo etched in warm brown, a wooden hearth surrounded by open hands. Nora's Hearth. meals, shelter, support, no one left behind. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. She looked again, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the name. Nora. There were plenty of Noras in the world, sure, but her gut told her the truth her heart wasn't ready for. It was her mother. The address listed was just a few blocks away, a street she used to drive past on her way to yoga class without ever noticing what sat at the corner. Her hands shook as she folded the flyer into her pocket. She didn't go that day or the next. But by the third morning, something shifted. She woke up with an ache behind her eyes and a hollowness in her chest she couldn't ignore. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, then got dressed in the least wrinkled clothes she had and walked across town in drizzling rain. She recognized the building before she reached it. The garden out front, the mural, the soft flicker of light in the windows. She paused at the door, soaked, breathless, and terrified. It felt like walking into a memory that had reshaped itself into something she no longer deserved to see. Then she opened the door. Warmth hit her not just from the heat inside, but from the smell of fresh bread, the murmur of conversation, the sound of quiet laughter in the back corner. A woman offered her a towel. Someone else handed her a mug of tea. Rachel blinked, and then at the counter, standing with her hands folded over a rag and her silver braid tucked neatly over her shoulder, was Nora. She hadn't changed much. Still upright, still calm, but there was something different. A glow that wasn't just health or age. It was purpose. It was peace. Rachel's lips parted. No sound came out. Her throat tightened. Nora looked up. Their eyes met. She didn't flinch. And Rachel felt something break loose inside her. Something heavy. Something she'd been holding too long. She stepped forward, hands shaking, voice barely a whisper. "Mom." I didn't know where else to go. Nora didn't rush. She didn't cry. She just walked slowly from behind the counter and stood in front of her daughter. Face open, eyes kind. "You look cold," she said softly. "Come in." And for the first time in years, Rachel obeyed. The public library smelled like damp paper and dust, a comforting scent Rachel hadn't known she missed. It had been years since she'd last stepped inside one, back when the kids were younger, and she'd still had enough energy to plan weekend outings, organize schedules, and pretend she had everything figured out. Now she was just trying to stay dry. Her coat was too thin for March rain. The soles of her shoes had started to separate, and she hadn't eaten a full meal in over a day. The temporary room she'd found through a friend of a friend wasn't heated. The heater made a sound like it wanted to die every time it kicked on, so she just let it stay off and wrapped herself in layers. Rachel had wandered into the library with no particular purpose, just warmth, just silence. She moved to the far end, past the children's books and the rows of outdated reference volumes, and settled into a corner where she could sit unnoticed. She rubbed her hands together, trying to shake off the cold, and looked around half-heartedly. A community bulletin board caught her eye, flyers tacked on with mismatched pins curling at the edges. She stood more out of boredom than interest and wandered over. She scanned the usual notices: babysitting services, missing cat, free yoga in the park. And then her eyes locked onto it. A flyer, cream-colored, elegant script, a simple wooden emblem carved in dark ink, a hearth surrounded by hands. Nora's hearth. Her breath caught. She read the words over and over again. Hot meals, shelter, support, no ID required, no paperwork. Everyone welcome. Location Sycamore Street and 11th, the corner building with the red door. Come as you are. The logo, the name, the street. She'd passed that intersection every week for years on her way to drop the kids at school. She remembered the building vaguely, a diner that had closed years ago. She'd never noticed it again after it shut down. It had just become another blur in the periphery of her life. She stood frozen in place, fingers gripping the edges of the flyer. Her eyes burned. She tried to swallow the lump forming in her throat. Nora. It had to be her. Rachel hadn't said her mother's name aloud in nearly 2 years, not because she hadn't thought of her, but because shame had a way of welding the mouth shut. There were nights she'd lie awake in that cold basement room, wondering where Nora had gone. She'd tried looking once half-heartedly with a quick online search, but nothing came up. No social media, no phone number, no obituary. She had convinced herself her mother had moved on. Or worse, hadn't. But this was her. Rachel felt the tremble in her hands as she folded the flyer into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against lint and old tissues. Her legs felt unsteady. She found her way back to the chair and sat down, trying to breathe through the dizziness. She closed her eyes and remembered the day she'd told Nora to leave. The way her mother's face hadn't cracked or pleaded, just nodded, accepted, walked away. No drama, no resistance, just a silence that haunted Rachel now in the empty spaces of her life. She had said it was about the kids, about money, but really it had been about control. Nora's presence had become a mirror, one Rachel didn't want to look into. She had judged her mother for being dependent, for aging, for taking up space. And now she was the one with nowhere left to go. That night, Rachel didn't sleep. She lay curled in her thin blanket, on the cot, replaying every harsh word she had spoken, every moment of indifference she had offered, and every time she had looked through her mother instead of at her. By morning, she was standing at a crosswalk 2 blocks from Sycamore and 11th, the flyer now creased and damp in her pocket. The wind cut through her sweater as she stared at the corner building. It had been completely transformed. A red door stood beneath a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "Nora's Hearth, all are welcome." There were flower beds along the front, wild and cheerful, and large windows glowing with warm light. Inside, she could see people sitting, eating, smiling. There was laughter, soft music. It didn't look like a shelter, it looked like home. Rachel hesitated at the curb, heart pounding. She hadn't planned what to say. She hadn't brought anything. She felt like an intruder in her own story. But then through the front window, she saw her. Nora was behind the counter, wiping down a mug with the same steady hands Rachel remembered from childhood, hands that had packed lunches, wiped tears, and held hers during thunderstorms. Her mother's hair was longer now, streaked fully silver and pulled into a low braid. She wore a soft beige cardigan and an apron with small sunflowers stitched along the edge. Rachel couldn't move. Her feet were planted in grief and longing. It took a man exiting the building to jostle her into action. He held the door for her, said, "Go on, they've got fresh stew today, best in town." She nodded without speaking and stepped inside. Warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. The scent of herbs and bread filled her lungs. Conversations buzzed softly. She felt her eyes well again. Nora hadn't noticed her yet. Rachel took one trembling step forward, then another, and for the first time in years, she let herself whisper her mother's name. Nora. But this time, it wasn't with blame. It was with hope. Rachel stood just inside the door, her wet shoes silent on the warm tile floor. Her body trembled not from the cold anymore, but from something deeper. Guilt, uncertainty, longing. She hadn't been called baby in years, and now even the idea of hearing it from her mother again nearly buckled her knees. Nora was behind the counter, cleaning a tray of mugs, her motions slow and practiced. Her silver braid hung down her back, her cardigan sleeves rolled to her elbows. She looked the same, in some ways solid calm, but there was something brighter about her now, something unshakable, like peace had woven itself into her skin. Rachel wanted to run to her, to collapse into her arms and beg for forgiveness, but she couldn't move. She stood, frozen eyes wide, her breath caught halfway between relief and dread. Then Nora looked up. Their eyes met. Time didn't slow down, it simply softened. Nora's expression didn't change. No surprise, no frown, no guarded defense. Just a deep, quiet, knowing. She placed the tray gently on the counter and stepped forward. Rachel opened her mouth, but the words failed. All she managed was a whisper, "I didn't know where else to go." Nora reached behind her, grabbed a clean dish towel, and walked around the counter. She didn't speak until she was standing inches from her daughter. And even then, it wasn't a lecture or a rebuke or a question. It was 5 words that cracked Rachel open. "You look tired." "Sit down, baby." Rachel let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, and her shoulders slumped under the weight of 2 years of regret. Nora took her gently by the elbow and led her to a small table in the corner, one with soft light and a vase of wildflowers someone had picked that morning. She sat Rachel down, placed a warm hand on her shoulder, then disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with a cup of tea, chamomile sweetened lightly with honey, just the way Rachel used to drink it in college. Nora hadn't forgotten. Rachel cradled the mug, her fingers trembling against the ceramic. She stared into the tea as if it held the right words. "I didn't think you'd—" she began, but her voice trailed off. Nora sat across from her, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady and soft. "You don't need to explain," she said. "Not yet. Just breathe. Just be." So Rachel did. For the first time in what felt like years, she let her body rest. The noise in her mind, shame, fear, desperation quieted under her mother's gaze. Around them, the hearth moved on. People ate, laughed, talked. Someone played a guitar near the front. A little boy dropped his spoon, and a volunteer retrieved it with a smile. But at that corner table, the world had narrowed to just the 2 of them. Finally, Rachel spoke. "I lost the house. Tyler left. The kids, they're with his sister. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I kept seeing your face. I didn't know if..." Nora reached across the table and gently took her hand. Her touch was warm, her fingers rough and familiar. "You don't have to carry it all right now," she said softly. "You're here. That's enough." Rachel looked up, her eyes welling. "I was awful to you. I threw you out like you didn't matter. I don't know why You were scared," Nora said. "I know. And sometimes fear makes us forget who we are. But it doesn't mean we can't find our way back." A tear slid down Rachel's cheek. She nodded, barely able to keep her voice steady. "I want to make it right." "You don't need to fix the past," Nora replied, squeezing her hand. "You just need to build something better going forward." For a long moment, they sat there in silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. It wasn't forgiveness offered with fireworks, or tears. It was given in warmth and presence, in the way Nora poured another cup of tea without asking if Rachel wanted it. She just knew. Over the next hour, Rachel learned more about the place she had stepped into. She heard stories from volunteers and guests, how the Hearth had become a safe space for people who were too often turned away elsewhere. She listened as Reggie described the breakfast club for kids before school. She watched as Nora greeted every person who entered with the same grace she'd once used to tuck her into bed after a nightmare. And Rachel realized something. Her mother hadn't just survived. She had built something beautiful, not to prove a point, not for revenge, but because she still believed in people, including the daughter who had failed her. That night, Rachel didn't return to the basement cot. She stayed at the Hearth on a fold-out cot in the staff room, wrapped in a donated quilt, listening to the hum of the building breathing around her. It wasn't just walls and chairs and pots on the stove. It was her mother's heart beating steady in every corner, and for the first time since her world collapsed, Rachel felt safe. Because coming home, she realized, didn't always mean returning to the past. Sometimes it meant stepping into what had been quietly waiting for you all along. Rachel began showing up every morning before the doors opened, sweeping the front walk and straightening chairs. No one asked her to. There was no formal schedule or title. She just belonged. Nora didn't say much about it. She didn't need to. Every time she passed her daughter and gave her a soft nod or a gentle squeeze on the shoulder, it spoke louder than any words ever could. It started with small things: wiping tables, restocking napkins, helping elderly guests carry trays to their seats. Then Rachel found herself reading books to children in the corner, reading Nook, helping them with spelling lists, science projects, and sometimes just listening as they told stories about missing parents or scary dreams. She found herself laughing, really laughing for the first time in years, and it wasn't forced, it was healing. She repaired a broken faucet in the kitchen with Reggie's help. Together, they made a game of labeling drawers and organizing pantry shelves. One afternoon, she repainted the garden fence, a cheerful shade of robin's egg blue humming softly to herself. Nora walked by, paused, and simply said, "Pretty color." It was her way of saying thank you, and it was enough. The past wasn't erased between them, but it wasn't a barrier either. Nora never brought up that day on the porch. She never asked for an explanation or apology, and Rachel never pushed for forgiveness with words. Instead, she gave it with action, plate by plate, smile by smile, late nights, mopping floors or early mornings, cracking eggs. She rebuilt her soul, not in grand gestures, but in quiet consistency. People at the Hearth began to notice. "She's like a second Nora," one guest whispered, after Rachel helped him find clean clothes and new shoes. And in many ways, she was. She had her mother's steadiness now, her calm patience. The fire she once reserved for self-preservation was now used to tend to others. One rainy evening, long after the dinner rush had faded, Rachel sat at the counter sipping herbal tea, her sleeves damp from the evening's dishes. The hearth was quiet, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant patter of rain on the roof. Nora came out from the back with something in her hands, a simple manila envelope slightly worn at the edges. She slid it across the counter. "This is for you." Rachel looked at it puzzled. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a deed, Rachel's childhood home, fully paid, freshly signed in Nora's name, and now transferred to her. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a note in her mother's neat cursive. "Not because you deserve it, but because love doesn't keep score." Rachel blinked at the page, reading it twice, then again. Her eyes blurred. She couldn't speak. She looked up at Nora, who just nodded. "You gave me everything once," Nora said softly. "This is just me returning what was never mine to begin with." Rachel swallowed hard, her heart swelling with something bigger than gratitude. She stood and crossed to where her mother was standing, then wrapped her arms around her in a long, quiet embrace. For the first time since she was a child, she felt the complete safety of her mother's love, with no conditions, no transaction, no shame. Years passed gently. Nora's hearth continued to grow, not in size, but in soul. More volunteers came, more guests found rest. The garden out back flourished. Kids who once came in hungry returned as young adults to help serve others. It became a circle, not a staircase. Rachel took on more and more responsibility. She eventually managed the day-to-day operations, trained volunteers, and even started a small mentorship program for single mothers needing community. She kept her mother's ways, no judgment, no paperwork, just presence. Then one fall morning, Nora didn't come down for tea. She passed peacefully in her sleep, a soft smile on her lips, and the morning sun slipping through her window like a gentle farewell. There was no panic, no tragedy, just the closing of a life fully lived. The memorial was held at Nora's hearth. Over 100 people came, some from shelters, others from churches, clinics, food banks. Many had no official titles, just stories. They brought flowers, photos, songs. One by one, they stood and shared how Nora had given them a meal, a moment of peace, a sense of being seen. No one spoke of her wealth because few knew. They spoke of her warmth. Rachel stood last, her mother's old apron folded in her hands. the sunflower stitching worn but intact. She looked out at the room, at the faces filled with grief and gratitude, and took a steady breath. She didn't raise her voice, Rachel said. She raised lives, quietly, with open hands, with presence. She never needed to be noticed because she made everyone else feel noticed. And somehow, in the simplest ways, she taught us that what's thrown away, her voice trembled, can still be reborn. There wasn't a dry eye in the hearth. As the guests slowly filtered out, many stopped to place a hand on Rachel's shoulder, to say thank you, to promise to carry on the work. That evening, Rachel walked out to the porch and looked up at the wooden arch Nora had carved years ago, the same one that hung above the front door since the very beginning. It read, "What's thrown away can still be reborn." She touched it gently, then turned back inside. The lights were on, the soup was simmering, and Nora's hearth was still open, just as it always would be.